Oh, you want me to start it?
Please. Sorry.
Hi, this is Frank Daniels. I'm a columnist with the Tennessean. I'm here today with our editorial page editor, Ted Rayburn, and we're going to talk about several topics today. I think we're going to start off with the debate that everybody's been talking about for the last several weeks, certainly since the election, that's the fiscal cliff. Ted, you want to kick us off with a little conversation about the fiscal cliff and
Sure.
what we're doing without parachutes?
Okay. Thank you, Frank. Yeah, I mean, obviously this is something that everybody's hearing about, maybe more than they want to hear about, but we feel it's a pretty strong issue, even if things don't go over what's almost like a literal or metaphorical cliff on January 1st. There's still some serious issues that they're going to have to address. And for us, it was very informational this week to meet with former Governor Phil Bredesen, met with our editorial board, and he is the head of the Tennessee Steering Committee for an organization called Fix the Debt. Their organization, they're not a lobby group, but they are a group of very mostly influential, very sensible and I would say wise people on issues of fiscal matters. Their position is that proposals such as the Bowles-Simpson recommendations would get the this debate in Washington started in the right direction. And so they're trying to go around, meet with different lawmakers in Washington, and just get things moving, this is my characterization, moving toward the middle and coming up with a real compromise. As specific as their proposals are, they would seem to have a consensus within Fix the Debt that a proposal that will really fix the debt in the long term, what they've called a grand bargain, would require about a quarter of the plan would be new revenue, and then the rest would be cuts in spending and mostly entitlement reform. And to us, we're going to probably be rewriting about this for our Sunday page this coming Sunday, but I would say I think that what they have to say, maybe it's not the solution, but it's certainly a move in the right direction and something that we all ought to be looking at, and maybe getting our members of Congress to start to listen to some folks like this.
When Bredesen and the group came, did you talk about the tactic that President Obama is pushing to separate the middle class tax cut expiration, and whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea? I mean, and what do you think about that?
Well, I do think that's a good idea. Myself, we did not discuss that in detail in the meeting. I do think that if only it reassured people who are so anxious just a few weeks after the election that anything is really going to happen before the end of the year, then I think that's something that both sides have said that they want, but yet it seems that it's being held out there as a bargaining chip until some other things fall into place, but it doesn't need to
But
be.
aren't they? Yeah, well, it seems to me that everything's a bargaining chip. That right now, both sides seem to be playing politics, and
Right.
By one group, President Obama is saying, let's do this because, of course, none of us want to see our taxes go up.
Right.
The politicking there seems to be disingenuous to
Yeah.
me.
But I do think that keeping the middle class tax cuts in place is a specific thing that both parties have said they want. So if that's the case, why not? They could pass it today if they wanted, and then still address the other pressing issues later.
The thing that, when I looked into that, the thing that bothered me about that whole process is the middle tax cuts that they want to continue forward are really things like cuts in Social Security payments. They are payroll tax cuts. So it's really not tax reform. It's just a short-term fix for a tax bill, the total tax payment. It's not about fixing what middle-class earners are paying in taxes. And that was the concern I had in what Obama is trying to push forward, that instead of fixing the problem, they're just extending the problem. and perhaps by doing that, they won't address the real issues that they've got to address. I was very concerned about the move that President Obama, and he's done a great job riling up his supporters to say that if you're not for that, then you're obviously for the rich people. You're for not solving the problem, and I think it's just the opposite. I think you got to solve the problem, not extend the problem.
Yeah. Well,
I've been going through a long dialogue with one of our readers who is upset that we're not pushing harder for the middle tax cut to be extended.
Right.
But I think that we've got to solve the problem. We can't just keep putting Band-Aids on.
Yeah, there are quite a few letters on that score, as a matter of fact, and I don't know if they're following this line of thought on 24-hour news or whatever, but it's a debate point, but it's not one that you hear coming out of the mouths of the people in Washington who are actually going to make these decisions. So, who knows? As far as the Social Security changes, that is something that Governor Bredesen and that organization, Fix the Debt, they do seem to feel like that's something that's going to have to happen, some kind of adjustment in the way it's done, although obviously it's not an entitlement in the same way that Medicare, they consider Medicare the far bigger problem right now. So.
Well, the next thing that I think we wanted to talk about, because the fiscal cliff is, as you said, is going to be something that's going to be in front of us for several more weeks. I don't think that, do you have high confidence that the problem is going to be resolved before January 1st yet? So I think that in some form or fashion, at this juncture, we both feel that we're going to be tumbling over the cliff, and whether it's going to be a gentle roll or a short drop, we don't know.
That's right.
The other thing we wanted to talk about today was the new report from the Annie E. Casey Foundation about young people and the problem that they're having finding jobs and the issues that it brings up, not only for today, but going downstream as they look at, as young people look at entering a career and getting long-term employment possibilities, that without a starter job, without learning how to work, that we're creating another hole in our recovery. So I know that you did some research and you were thinking about that earlier.
Yeah, we actually published an editorial today on this issue because the numbers from the Annie E. Casey Foundation report, the Kids Count project, it's pretty alarming, and I think it kind of gets pushed below the scene by the fact that most of the things you hear about unemployment are about the people who have been long-term breadwinners with careers who are feeding their family and trying to make ends meet, and suddenly they're displaced. Well, of course, what it turns out is happening is that a lot of these folks are now competing for very basic entry-level jobs. Maybe it's their second job or their third job, but they're competing with people who are like 16 years old for what for them, or what we would think of used to be a starter job. And as a result of this, there are now some 4.3 million Americans ages 16 to 24 who are not working. And I suppose if you're in an upper income level, you might say, well, they need to focus on their studies or whatever anyway, but I think that most people would agree that a job, especially your first job, is very important in instilling a lot of skills that are needed that you may not be able to get in an educational setting. And they certainly show you what it means to be a productive member of society, contributing to the workforce. And there are just millions and millions of Americans right now who are not getting that opportunity. And it's not to blame the older workers, it's just, here's the situation we've come to. I think I think about this when we talk about the fiscal cliff and the debt problems, because really, in a lot of ways, you could say that if they would deal with unemployment and job programs, job retraining at the federal level, that it might be a better use of their time. I certainly think a lot of the people who voted in this last election were hoping that something like that would take place.
Has there been, when you were thinking about the editorial and you're doing your research, What discussion have you seen about maybe changes in the minimum wage laws that would encourage employers to perhaps hire more entry-level workers in a variety of different ways?
That is a component of it that was not addressed in that study, but certainly we get a lot of feedback from, especially from small business owners who are worried about the level of the minimum wage and that it being too high, and saying that, you know, without it they could hire more people or keep more people on the job. But you know, the other side of that too is you know, what the lack of a minimum wage supposedly does to a large segment of the population, you know, who is trying to keep a family going, who's maybe less educated, and for them a regular job is a lower paying job.
So there's two different things, right? There's the group of people that need a minimum wage, or think about a minimum wage as a way to sustain and move forward in terms of creating enough income to pay for a family. And then there's the challenge of a minimum wage, and that it does lift up the cost to businesses and may prevent them from hiring inexperienced workers who might not be worth $7.25 an hour. That perhaps there are ways to go about that. Has that been any of the discussion that you looked at?
Not a great deal. I think what the report talked about was partnerships in the community between businesses, local leaders, maybe even the educational institutions, to come up with ways for younger workers and even teenagers to get in the workforce somehow. And I think what we suggested was maybe more opportunities, and this is not necessarily about pay. It's about learning to work.
Right.
So internships are possibilities, apprenticeship programs. Apprenticeship programs have been talked about a lot recently, not only for younger workers, but for displaced workers who need a second career, as a way to go into it without employers having to pay huge salaries on someone that is an unknown commodity. So I think that might be more of the focus as we're trying to get so many people into their jobs for the first time.
Well, it's an interesting challenge between the minimum wage for creating living wages and the minimum wage preventing people from getting that starter job and learning how to move forward. The last thing that we wanted to talk about was you were going to bring it up. What was it?
Oh, well, of course, we also had this, and it was in the national news earlier this week, that a number, I think it's 5 states, have agreed to programs in partnership with the U.S. Education Department to look at longer school days, possibly a longer school year for public school kids. And of course, Tennessee is one of those states. And we have not editorialized on this yet, although we may. But it certainly is a part of probably our largest single subject that we deal with on the opinion pages is education, particularly in Tennessee, because as you know, it's just as important as any subject that we deal with about the fate of our state.
And the proposal is to extend the school year to how many days?
I'm sorry, I don't have that number.
But it's 180
currently,
and it goes like I think to 220 days. So it's a huge change,
right.
And we'll be keeping track of that as we go forward.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back next Wednesday. Either Ted or myself or our other columnist, Gail Carr, will be here on Wednesday talking at 3 o'clock about issues in our community. Thank you for joining us.